bill earlier, well, late last year, that was called the Genius Act, and that was really seminal. It was the first statute that the United States government has adopted to recognize a crypto asset. So that was great, and it helped to bring clarity.
When someone like Paul Atkins talks about the future of finance, he's not speaking in slogans. He's not chasing attention. He's speaking from a worldview shaped by regulation, institutions, and how capital actually behaves when the lights are on and the doors are locked. So when names like XRP, XLM, HBAR, and XDC start showing up in the same sentence, that's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. And patterns are what serious money follows. Here's the thing most people miss. Paul Atkins isn't predicting prices. He's not calling tops or bottoms. He's describing structure.
So that was great, and it helped to bring clarity also to stable coins. And so now comes the next step, a good bipartisan effort by both houses of Congress to bring certainty to, again, to the market structure regarding cryptocurrencies. And this fits in with the president's focus on making America the crypto capital of the world. So if you have clear legislation and clear rules, then you have certainty in the marketplace. And so I think we're behind it. We are very bullish on the effects of a bill getting to the president.
He's talking about which systems are compatible with the future that regulators, institutions, and governments are quietly building. That's a very different conversation than the one happening on social media. Because while retail argues about charts, institutions argue about survivability. And survivability doesn't come from hype. It comes from alignment. XRP, XLM, HBAR, and XDC all share something that very few crypto assets do. They were designed to exist in a world where rules matter. Not fight them, not evade them, not complain about them. Work with them. That alone puts them in a different category. Paul Atkins understands this because he understands how markets mature. Early phases reward chaos. Later phases reward coordination. Crypto is moving out of its chaotic phase. Not all at once. Not cleanly, but unmistakably. And in that transition, assets that were built for structure start to separate themselves from assets built for speculation. XRP wasn't created to be exciting. It was created to move value efficiently between institutions that already exist. XLM wasn't built to overthrow banks. It was built to connect systems across borders without friction. HBAR wasn't designed for anonymous rebellion. It was designed for enterprise-grade trust and governance. XDC wasn't chasing retail attention. It was focused on trade finance, settlement, and real-world utility. These aren't narratives invented after the fact. They're design choices. And design choices matter when the environment changes. Paul Atkins has spent his career watching markets evolve under regulatory pressure. He's seen what survives when rules tighten and what disappears when speculation fades. So when he speaks favorably about assets like these, he's not saying they'll moon. He's saying they fit. They fit a future where compliance is not optional, where interoperability is required, where institutions can't afford to experiment recklessly. That future doesn't reward maximalists. It rewards bridges. And every asset on that list is a bridge in some form. Between legacy finance and blockchain. Between jurisdictions. Between systems that were never designed to talk to each other. This is why the conversation feels different this time. It's not about replacing the old system overnight. It's about upgrading it quietly. Paul Atkins represents a mindset that sees crypto not as a revolution, but as infrastructure. And infrastructure doesn't ask for permission from public opinion. It gets adopted because it works. This is where a lot of people get uncomfortable. Because infrastructure doesn't move fast emotionally. It moves slowly, deliberately, and then all at once. When XRP settles a transaction, nobody celebrates. When XLM connects remittance corridors, nobody throws a party. When HBR supports enterprise use cases, nobody posts memes. When XDC improves trade settlement efficiency, nobody trends it on social media. But money notices. Institutions notice. Regulators notice. And once they notice, momentum builds in places retail can't see. Paul Atkins understands that regulation isn't the enemy of innovation. Uncertainty is. Clear rules don't kill progress. They channel it. And assets that were built with clarity in mind don't need to scramble when the environment changes. They simply continue. That's why this moment matters. Not because someone famous said something bullish, but because someone experienced recognized alignment. Alignment between technology and policy, between innovation and regulation, between ambition and reality. Crypto has spent years pretending those things don't need to coexist. They do. And the assets that acknowledge that reality early tend to be the ones still standing later. So if you're holding XRP, XLM, HBAR, or XDC and wondering why the journey feels slower, heavier, more restrained than other narratives, this is why. You're not holding chaos. You're holding infrastructure. And infrastructure is invisible until it becomes unavoidable. Paul Atkins isn't telling you what to buy. He's telling you what kind of future is being built. And in that future, the systems that survive aren't the loudest. They're the ones that were ready when the rules finally mattered. So the real question isn't whether these assets are the future. It's whether you're prepared to hold something designed for a world that's finally growing up. Because once that world locks into place, the conversation changes. And by the time everyone agrees, positioning is already done. What happens when the market stops rewarding noise and starts rewarding fit? There's a reason Paul Atkins' perspective lands differently once you sit with it for a while. It's not because he's saying something shocking. It's because he's saying something inevitable. When people who've lived inside regulatory systems talk about the future, they don't speak in absolutes. They speak in constraints. What can exist? What can scale? What can survive scrutiny? And when you view crypto through that lens, the field narrows very quickly. Most digital assets were created for an environment that no longer exists. An environment where rules were unclear, enforcement was slow, and experimentation came with little consequence. That window is closing. Not dramatically, not with a single announcement, but with a steady tightening that changes incentives over time. Paul Atkins understands this rhythm because he's seen it before. Markets always start wild. Then they mature. And maturity doesn't ask for permission. It demands accountability. That's where XRP, XLM, HBAR, and XDC quietly stand apart. They don't depend on ambiguity to justify their existence. They function because structure exists. That distinction becomes critical once regulation stops being theoretical and starts being operational. Think about what institutions actually need. They don't need ideology. They need rails. They need systems that can move value reliably, transparently, and within defined boundaries. XRP was built with liquidity and settlement in mind, not speculation. XLM was designed to connect financial endpoints across borders without friction. HBAR prioritized enterprise governance and predictable performance. XDC focused on trade finance and real-world settlement flows. These are not coincidences. They're responses to real constraints. And constraints shape the future more than dreams ever do. Paul Atkins isn't saying these assets are special because they're crypto. He's saying they matter because they behave like infrastructure. Infrastructure doesn't compete on excitement. Competes on compatibility. That's a hard truth for a market addicted to narratives. But it's also why this next phase feels so different. Crypto is no longer asking, can we do this? It's asking, can we deploy this responsibly? That question filters out a lot of noise. It also changes how value accrues. Speculative assets thrive in uncertainty. Infrastructure assets thrive in clarity. The more rules are defined, the more important compatibility becomes. That's why regulatory clarity doesn't kill innovation. It channels it towards systems that can actually be used. Paul Atkins sees this because he spent years watching capital move under constraints. He knows that when compliance officers say yes, money flows. When they say no, nothing else matters. And compliance officers don't care about promises. They care about processes. They care about governance. They care about whether a system can operate without creating legal exposure. That's where Hbar's governance model matters. That's where XLM's focus on regulated endpoints matters. That's where XRP's institutional design matters. That's where XDC's trade finance orientation matters. Each of these networks solves a different part of the same problem. How do you move value in a world that still runs on laws? Paul Atkins understands that crypto won't replace the system by force. It will replace parts of it by being better. Cheaper settlement, faster reconciliation, reduced counterparty risk. These aren't revolutionary ideas. They're operational improvements. And operational improvements are how systems evolve quietly. This is also why price conversations feel premature in this context. Infrastructure doesn't get repriced until after it's embedded. Before that, it looks boring, underwhelming, ignored. That's the phase many of these assets are still in. Not because they failed, but because the environment they were designed for is just now arriving. Paul Atkins isn't early in his thinking. The market is late in catching up. Another uncomfortable truth is that not all crypto can make this transition. Some assets require chaos to stay relevant. They rely on emotional trading, loose definitions, and constant narrative reinvention. Once clarity arrives, those advantages disappear. What remains is function, and function is not equally distributed. XRP, XLM, HBAR, and XDC were built with function at the core, not as an afterthought. That doesn't guarantee dominance, but it guarantees relevance. And relevance is the most valuable currency in a maturing market. Paul Atkins believes in these assets not because they promise freedom from regulation, but because they demonstrate compatibility with it. That's a subtle but crucial distinction. It's the difference between fighting the tide and building a vessel that works with it. As crypto grows up, it will stop rewarding those who resist structure and start rewarding those who anticipated it. That's not ideology. That's history. Every financial innovation follows this path. Chaos first, clarity later, consolidation after that. We're moving into the clarity phase now, and the assets that were built for that phase won't need to reinvent themselves. They'll simply step into roles that were waiting for them. So if you're trying to understand why Paul Atkins' view matters, it's not because he's predicting winners. It's because he's describing the environment. And environments determine outcomes more than opinions ever will. The future he sees isn't dramatic. It's structured. And in a structured future, systems that were designed with discipline tend to outlast those built on excitement. That's the lens through which this entire conversation makes sense. Not as hype, not as prophecy, but as preparation. Because when the rules are finally clear, the market won't ask who was loud. It will ask who was ready. And readiness is exactly what these networks were built for. The only remaining question is whether patience will be rewarded before most people lose it. There's a moment in every market shift where the conversation quietly changes. Not publicly, not on headlines, but internally. That's the moment Paul Atkins is really pointing toward. It's when decision-makers stop asking whether something is allowed and start asking how it can be implemented without breaking anything. That transition matters more than any announcement. Because once implementation becomes the focus, the criteria for success become very narrow. Reliability, governance, predictability, and suddenly the crypto landscape looks very different. This is where XRP, XLM, HBAR, and XDC begin to feel less like crypto projects and more like components. Components in a larger financial machine that is being slowly re-engineered. Paul Atkins understands something most retail investors don't get to see. Markets don't transform because of belief. They transform because of incentives. And incentives change when regulation moves from abstract to actionable. Once the rules are written clearly, firms stop debating philosophy and start allocating budgets. Legal teams sign off. Risk departments get comfortable. Technology teams start building. That's when networks with clean governance structures and clear use cases gain traction. Because friction becomes expensive. Every unknown becomes a liability. And institutions are allergic to liabilities they can't quantify. This is why governance matters more than decentralization theater in the next phase. Hbar's council model is often misunderstood because people confuse decentralization with chaos. But enterprises don't want chaos. They want shared responsibility. They want accountability without single-point failure. They want decision-making frameworks they can explain to regulators. That's why heterostructure resonates in regulated environments. XRP and XLM operate differently, but they solve similar problems. They focus on liquidity, settlement, and interoperability. They don't try to replace institutions. They try to make institutions work better. That's a crucial difference. Paul Atkins sees crypto not as an enemy of finance, but as an upgrade layer. And upgrade layers don't need to be revolutionary. They need to be dependable. XDC fits into this picture through trade finance, one of the most paper-heavy, inefficient parts of global commerce. That's not a flashy sector, but it's a massive one. And inefficiencies there cost billions quietly every year. Solving those problems doesn't generate hype. It generates adoption. The thing about adoption in regulated markets is that it doesn't announce itself. Pilot programs don't trend. Internal deployments don't go viral. Proof of concepts aren't marketed. They're evaluated. And once they pass evaluation, they're scaled quietly. Paul Atkins understands this rhythm because he's watched it across decades. Financial systems don't change in public. They change behind closed doors. Then one day, the public realizes the old way is gone. This is why patience becomes the most misunderstood asset in this phase. People expect signals. They want validation. They want confirmation that they're early. But infrastructure adoption rarely offers emotional reassurance. It offers delayed certainty. XRP, XLM, HBAR, and XDC don't need retail excitement to succeed. Paul Atkins believes in these assets because they don't ask institutions to take leaps of faith. They ask them to take measured steps. That's a huge difference. Crypto culture often celebrates disruption. But disruption is risky when money is involved. Upgrades are safer, and safer options get chosen more often. This also explains why these assets often feel undervalued relative to louder narratives. They aren't priced for imagination. They're priced for utility that hasn't fully surfaced yet. Once utility becomes visible, repricing happens quickly. But before that, value accumulates quietly. Another thing clarity does is expose fragility. Projects that rely on constant narrative reinforcement struggle when scrutiny increases. Projects that rely on functional demand survive. Paul Atkins sees which category these networks fall into. They don't need constant reinvention. They don't pivot every cycle. They've stayed remarkably consistent in their goals. Consistency is boring until it isn't. It's boring until the market realizes how rare it is. XRP has always focused on cross-border settlement. XLM has always focused on accessibility and interoperability. HBAR has always focused on enterprise trust and performance. XDC has always focused on trade and real-world finance. Those missions didn't change when trends did. That stability matters when regulation tightens. Because regulators prefer predictability. Institutions prefer predictability. Capital prefers predictability. Paul Atkins isn't betting on a narrative shift. He's recognizing a structural alignment. The future he's describing doesn't belong to the loudest projects. It belongs to the most compatible ones. And compatibility isn't something you can fake at the last minute. It has to be built from the beginning. That's why these assets keep appearing in serious conversations. Not because they're exciting, but because they're usable. And usability is what survives when markets mature. So when you hear Paul Atkins talk about the future, don't listen for hype. Listen for constraints. Listen for what's allowed. Listen for what scales. Because once those boundaries are clear, the market doesn't debate anymore. It selects. And selection is rarely democratic. It's practical. The real question, then, isn't whether these assets are the future. It's whether the future Paul Atkins sees is already being built quietly around them. And if that's the case, the loudest moment may come long after the most important decisions have already been made. At some point, every market has to grow up. Not in a dramatic way, not with a single announcement, but with a quiet shift in priorities. That's the shift Paul Atkins is really pointing to. A future where crypto isn't judged by how loud it is, but by how well it fits. Because once rules are clear and institutions are involved, the game stops being about speculation and starts being about reliability. And reliability changes everything. In that environment, XRP, XLM, HBAR, and XDC don't need to prove they belong. They were built for it. They don't need to reinvent themselves every cycle. They don't need to chase narratives. They don't need permission from social media. They simply need the environment to become what it was always going to become. Structured. That's why this moment feels slow to some people and obvious to others. If you're still looking for fireworks, this phase can feel disappointing. But if you're looking for positioning, it feels calm, almost reassuring. Because infrastructure doesn't rush. It waits. It gets tested quietly. It gets integrated carefully. And then one day it becomes indispensable. Paul Atkins isn't telling you when prices will move. He's telling you what kind of systems will still be standing once the dust settles. And that's a much more valuable signal. Markets don't reward conviction alone. They reward alignment. Alignment between technology and regulation. Between innovation and responsibility. Between ambition and reality. XRP, XLM, HBAR, and XDC sit at that intersection. Not perfectly, not without challenges, but deliberately. They chose the harder path early. The path that didn't generate excitement. The path that required patience. And patience is often the price of relevance. So if you're holding these assets and feeling conflicted, that's normal. Because you're not holding chaos. You're holding something designed to operate when chaos fades. That's uncomfortable in a market trained to chase adrenaline. But it's also where real systems are built. The future Paul Atkins sees isn't explosive. It's operational. It's the kind of future where crypto stops trying to prove itself and starts quietly doing the work it promised. And once that happens, the conversation changes. Not overnight, but permanently. By the time most people agree, the positioning phase is already over. That's usually how these shifts work. And that's why listening to people who understand structure matters more than listening to people who predict excitement. Because excitement fades. Structure lasts. If this gave you a clearer perspective beyond price and hype, tap the like button. Subscribe for calm, honest breakdowns of where crypto is actually headed. And comment one word that describes how you feel about XRP, XLM, HBAR, and XDC right now.